consultant, and they had a hearing access device that they wanted to take to mainstream education. So I thought it sounded like a good idea at the time. So I actually left teaching and joined this company. I was with them for about 18 months. And it was great fieldwork experience. It opened my eyes. I visited over 200 schools in that time in the consultancy role, and subsequently to that I've left and sort of heading back into the academic teaching sort of domain in sorts. And I'm also doing a federally funded project for the Catholic Education Office called More Support for Students with Disability Project, where I help identify assistive technologies for kids with disability in mainstream education, and try to bridge them into the learning environment through the use of technology, followed by professional development teachers. So anyway, let's go through this. Excuse me if I read a bit so I can stick to the task. Paulo Freire, 1970, to surmount a situation of oppression, people must first critically recognise its causes so that through transforming action, they can create a new situation, one which makes possible pursuit of fuller humanity. Vygotsky stresses the intactness rather than the deficit of the child. A handicapped child represents a qualitatively different, unique type of development. If a blind or a deaf child achieves the same level of development as the normal child, then the child with a defect achieves this in another way, by another course, by another means. And for the pedagogue, it is particularly important to know the uniqueness along the course he must lead the child. This uniqueness transforms the minus of the handicap into the plus, the compensation. So my research question is, what affordances are required for inclusion of students with hearing difficulties in new generation learning spaces? Technology is changing the nature of global economies. As a consequence, locally, our workforces and education systems are being reshaped. Today's kids not only use a variety of technologies available to them, they are beginning to invent new ones to help them navigate their worlds. This is an exciting prospect for a child with a disability. Imagine, what will a child with a sensory disorder such as deafness or blindness be able to achieve with the assistance of innovative, intuitive technologies? Will kids with disability in mainstream schools, alongside their peers, solve real-life problems by developing their own apps to help overcome accessibility issues in their own learning environment? What will education systems need to do to enable this to happen? These kids are already in our schools writing code. When teaching kids with hearing difficulties in traditional learning environments, we sat them up the front. Teacher was the captain and commander, minimal movement, no talking, lots of written material, 4 walls and a door to close. Today, there appears no front and very few walls to block the noise. Transformations to the shape and configuration of the learning space have emerged in an effort to change teaching practices and learning outcomes. It is widely recognised that new generation learning spaces are underpinned by a philosophy that learning is constructed in a social context. An overwhelming majority of students diagnosed with hearing loss attend mainstream school settings. Of these students, many are academically underperforming. This statistic has not changed or shifted in on 20 years. Defining the terms. Mainstream implies that children will need to make adaptations to fit into the majority culture. Inclusion signifies that the program will make adaptations to fit the needs of all students in the classroom. Mainstream or inclusive setting. A mainstream or inclusive setting. A hearing difficulty is defined as an auditory disorder, hearing loss, and/or auditory processing disorder, or APD. APD is a condition that impacts listening, concentration, and attention switching abilities in the presence of peripheral and background noise. Auditory disorders impact individuals differently. However, all participants identified in this study have listening and noise difficulties over and above that of their peers. Now, depending on whether you believe it is the ear or the brain that hears, there is a wide body of evidence that tells us approximately 25 to 30% of children in the early learning years will have a permanent or transient hearing difficulty impacting their listening abilities. Approximately 15 to 20% of students aged 12 to 26 will find speech intelligibility difficult in the presence of peripheral and background noise. These kids are susceptible to cognitive fatigue, oral language deficits, and have problems with conversations in a social context. Aboriginal children have the worst hearing of any cohort of children worldwide. When communication is not pleasurable, all sorts of behaviours emanate. Literacy development is impacted for all of these kids. If you can't hear it, you can't say it. You may be able to write it, but it has limited meaning beyond its initial context. The methodology, methods and data collection for this research were decided by first mapping the territory, defining the problem and making a stance and taking a theoretical position. To begin the research, I chose Brinkerhoff's 2003 success case methodology. Success case methodology focuses on few cases to provide rich, in-depth data and advocates the investigations of instances of extremes. For example, successful participant cases and sites. The focus is on the performance management system and the role that learning plays in it to achieve results. Success case methodology recognises that learning is a necessary but not sufficient condition to produce outcomes. Performance is the driver of impact. For the purpose of this study, I have defined new generation learning environments as purpose-built, technology-rich, open-plan spaces designed to facilitate differentiated and personalised learning where students and teachers collaborate and co-construct learning in a social context. We've all seen this today. The next methodology decision I made was to ground the study using Radcliffe's 2008 Learning Environments Evaluation Framework. This framework maps the territory of the built environment by considering the elements of pedagogy, space, technology, and how these elements speak to the quality of an experience in a space. I want to explore, from the perception of the child, what I call the spaces in between. The interplay between newly constructed buildings, technology, pedagogy, and the child's lived experience, that is the child with the hearing difficulty in these spaces. Radcliffe provides a point of reference when listening to student voice. I chose the school site first and foremost after visiting many sites. The research is about, in its entirety, this research really is about governance and policy and the impact on the individual. An affordance is defined as the quality of an object or an environment which allows an individual to perform an action. I've chosen to study 3 students as cases in one school with new generation learning environments. The research evaluates the performance of the new generation learning environment from the perspective of the child with hearing difficulties. This is a qualitative case study research project that privileges the voice of the student and their perception of inclusion around 3 central themes: the built environment, accessibility to technology, and how the teacher co-constructs learning experiences for the students.
9 minutes.
Quantitative building acoustic measures will be gathered to determine the building's capacity to control noise. And the goals of the collection are to determine the students' perceived level of inclusion, to determine the degree to which the building supports inclusion of students with hearing difficulties, and to track human movement and interactions throughout the space, see how both the students and the teachers interact with physical classroom features and available technologies. These are some of the methods: semi-structured interviews, photo elicitation, quantitative building acoustic measures, and looking at artefacts such as architectural drawings. Brinkerhoff's success case methodology, Radcliffe's framework, Vygotsky and Freire are some of the theories underpinning, and Dr. Siddhartha Mitra, complexity theories and emergence. Producing things way beyond what you think the system is capable of, on the edge of chaos. Finally, broad approaches are supported by Kelikoff, who puts the case for a mosaic approach which involves the implementation of a series of textured, complementary evaluation strategies that aim to provide reliable and detailed information about what is being accomplished in the context of the particular environment under investigation. So what affordances are required for students with hearing difficulties, and what is their perception of their level of inclusion? That's what I'm looking at.
Leanne, we'll come back. So hold questions for Leanne. Our next speaker is Jo Dane. As it says in the bio here, Jo is a designer, educator and researcher with a passion for educational transformation enabled through research-based design practice. Jo's day job is working at Woods Bagot. She's also the past chair of the Sexy Victorian chapter, and her paper is entitled The Effective Teaching and Learning Spatial Framework. Thanks, Jo.
I'll start on the presentation anyway as the slides coming up. I started doing this research, my PhD, very long time ago. I should also actually just declare that Peter Jamieson is my supervisor. So just in case you thought that he was going to be, that would be an advantage to me, he promised me it's going to be much tougher. So, you know, my research started quite a long time ago, and I started thinking about student-centered learning. I was looking for a framework for the case studies that I had done, and this term effective teaching and learning kept leaping out of the pages of the literature. And so I started interrogating this term more deeply and realised that there was a lot of, amongst the researchers in the field of effective teaching and learning, that there were some common elements that linked them all together. So I sought to distill those common elements, and it ended up coming up with 6 key attributes that relate to effective teaching and learning. And you know, I've got some of the literature references there. I'd love to have time to sort of go into that in a lot more detail, but obviously 10 minutes is limiting. So these are the 6 effective teaching and learning attributes. And what I was interested in is, if this is what the literature describes effective teaching and learning to be, then what does that look like in the classroom? And what are the spatial implications of these elements? So I should also point out, you know, my background is in design, so I'm also naturally interested in the spatial implications, but I was particularly engaging with the student-centered learning literature at this point. What I'll just do briefly is to run through each of these 6 elements. So effective teaching and learning promotes student activity and engagement with content, empowers students with choices and maintains interest through a variety of activities, resources and learning styles. And so from that, and drawing upon the case study observations that I've been making, there are certain behaviours that are associated with this particular element. It might be that students can engage with learning content in a variety of ways that may be either individual or group-based. I won't go through every single one. You know, students can capture content that's presented by the teacher and or product of their interactions with each other. So when we start to think about what these behaviours are that contribute to the effective teaching and learning, then we start to think about, well, what are the spatial implications? And I'll explain why these are deliberately non-deterministic in the sense they're a bit, you know, so spaciousness, you know, the ability to have space so that students can actually move around and that the teacher can move around the classroom easily, accessible educational technologies, mobile furniture. So a lot of the things that we've been hearing about from presenters already today. I've got some images, these are from my case studies, just talking about the difference between, you know, accessible technology and mobile furniture, for example, in this room meant that students could start an activity in the centre of the room, that they could push that, you know, the furniture out of the way essentially and move to the perimeter of the room to access the computers. Now, I also acknowledge that these case studies are a few years old now, so they're looking a little bit outdated. There's lots of improved versions of new generation learning spaces since. But I think this theoretical framework still holds up to the old and new. Second point, encourages the teacher to view teaching from the student's perspective and build meaningful relationships with the students. So that's coming from the effective teaching and learning theory, but what does that mean in terms of behaviour? Well, the teacher and the students can access the same educational technology. The teacher is able to engage with the students either individually, in small groups, or as a whole cohort. And then what does that mean in terms of space? Well, it might mean that you've got a variety of furniture settings that you can move around, or to undertake different types of activities, and that you've got active surfaces for sharing ideas and experiences, so that students can actually share their ideas. And here is another case study. There are 3 different learning spaces here that contribute to a whole precinct for electrical engineering school at the Victoria University, which they call their problem-based learning precinct. Again, I can't go into too much detail. The third element is a social process where knowledge is socially constructed. So what does that mean in terms of behaviour? You start to talk about students being able to hear and watch the teacher and other students. Students are able to interact at a personal or social distance as tasks have been established. So here I'm actually drawing on some environmental psychology theory that talks about distance and behaviour. Different students may be undertaking activities at different levels of engagement at varying distances. So it's the notion that you can have different activities taking place in the same space at the same time. It's not everybody doing the same activity at the same time. And then you've got spatial implications. Now, these spatial implications, there's a repetition across the different elements. They're not, I'm not trying to devise a separate spatial implication for each element. But here you can start to see some of the spaces that we've looked at that reflect this. Element 4, how am I going for time then?
You've got 4 more minutes.
Okay, good. Item 4 fosters a deep approach to learning that encourages student independence. So there's a lot of talk in the theoretical literature about deep learning. So what does that mean in terms of behaviour? Well, students make choices about their learning activities and content in consultation with the teacher. Students are able to express their previous knowledge and experiences relevant to their learning encounters through discussion and activity. And so if these are the sorts of behaviours relating to this particular element, then again, what are the spatial implications? Moving item 5 is effective teaching and learning. It's contextualised and relevant. Teachers have awareness of student prior learning. I think this is actually one of the most fundamental ones because it's something that comes up again and again in the literature, but we don't necessarily discuss it in terms of what that might mean in terms of space. In terms of behaviour, students undertake learning activities that are relevant to them and with their own learning context. That students can work at their own pace, and that various students may undertake different activities simultaneously. So again, there's some commonality among some of these elements. What does that mean in terms of space, accessible educational technologies, variety of furniture settings, etc. These were not case study spaces for my PhD, but a couple of other environments that I've been able to do some evaluation on. Again, you can see accessible technologies, just different examples of variety of furniture settings, etc. And finally, that effective teaching and learning involves teachers continually evaluating students and how they perceive their learning situation. That, you're talking about being able to assess and provide feedback to the students, and again, what that means in terms of behaviour and space. I'll quickly just move straight. I was going to just point out this is a project that Peter and I actually worked on together, because this kind of encapsulates all of those effective teaching and learning elements in an environment that we're consciously designed based on this particular framework. So this is the effective teaching and learning spatial framework in its entirety, and I think it's got 3 potentially useful applications. One is that it can be used as a simple evaluation tool. that it's something that everybody can actually engage in by looking at the different sorts of behaviours that, and looking at the spatial implications, that you don't necessarily have to be a specialist in the field to be able to evaluate a particular environment. Another application is that it'd be quite useful as a design tool, as, you know, dare I say, a bit of a checklist for design. And this is where I meant the spatial implications are deliberately non-deterministic, because we still want designers and architects to have the creativity and innovation to be able to create engaging learning spaces. And then the third element is this could be used as a mechanism for professional development of teachers. So in the act of promoting effective teaching and learning, this framework could be used as a means of being able to talk about the sorts of behaviours associated with effective teaching and learning, and therefore the spatial characteristics that would be associated with those behaviours. So it's looking at the literature, the theory in terms of education, the behaviour, and then the spatial characteristics, and linking them all together. Thank you.
Maybe I'll ask Joe and Leanne to hang around the front this time so I don't lose any order. Just to get the ball rolling again, a question to each of you. Leanne, first off, you used the phrase, question, you asked a question, so how do you capture the student's lived experience, which is a literature that I'm particularly interested in. So that caught my attention. So my question to you is, how do you, through your methodology, intend to capture that aspect of it? You described your methodology and there was a focus on other things, of course, but this is the area that I'm particularly interested in, so I want to focus on that. How are you going to capture the student's lived experience, and what do you understand that to mean?
Okay, so pragmatically from the beginning of the day, so I've got 3 case study students, for each I'll repeat the same. So I'm going to spend a day in the school. I've spent lots of time in the school, and I'll go back and do some unstructured observations, take some fieldwork notes, and take some photos myself. On the structured observation day, I intend to track through time from the time that the student arrives at starting about 9:30 till 3 o'clock. When they're in the learning environment, I'll take photos at every significant change of activity, and I'll log that. So I'll have a photo of where the student is at that particular space and time. I've then got the artefact of the architectural drawing, so I can then map that against there and track the movement of the student around the place. By taking the photos, they elicit a response from the student when I'm actually talking to them in conversation in semi-structured interviews, which will occur at the very next morning after the day of observation. So I'm not grabbing the student at the end of a busy day at school and then bang, interviewing them. I'll go back the very next morning, and with the photos from the day before, I'm hoping to elicit a conversation with the students about their thoughts and feelings throughout that particular time. So I'm capturing, in essence, a moment in time. But I would like to triangulate their voice, their student voice, what they're telling us about the spaces and places they like to be, the types of activities and the way they were thinking and feeling during the engagement or not of that particular experience in that activity. So I'm hoping to use, to sort of mitigate researcher bias and seeing things through our lens, I'm hoping to look at things like building acoustics and then interview the teachers later to see what their perception of what the child has said was. So the central focus the whole time is going to be student voice. Before I interview any of the teachers or any other adults on site, I want to have done the 3 case study students so that I am not tainted by what the adults are guiding me to look for.
Thank you. Just to follow up if I can, I've been doing observations of the lived experience on campus at various campuses and using a method which, when you go in with no preconception about what you're going to observe, it's a particularly interesting approach. And one of the things I've been overwhelmed by, completely shocked me, is the range of sounds. Because when I've been looking, I'm looking and I'm seeing. The moment that I wasn't going to look for anything in particular, I noticed that I was hearing an enormous range of sounds on campuses in Canada and Australia. So my question is, are you intending to capture any of the acoustic properties, or how can we know what the student's acoustic experience is like, given that that's focus, I think, of what you want about.
Yep, so I've actually got an acoustical engineer coming in, and we're going to take some sound level meter readings to develop what we call a baseline of building acoustics. So through what we do is put a noise logger in, and we track the noise in the particular environment over a period of time, and that will tell us its peaks and troughs. We'll then measure the reverberation levels, which is the ability of the building to provide a level of speech intelligibility so your voice doesn't bounce and echo and get lost. So we will have these baseline measures from a scientific perspective, so to speak. So we will have this, the reverberation levels, the peak noise levels throughout the day, and because of photo elicitation is time-stamped, if we elicit a response from a student telling us about a particular experience in time, we can go back to the acoustical performance at that moment in time. Now, it's a generalist. It's not like you can actually use a dosimeter and track a student at almost ear level as to what they're hearing. That's a personal device, and that's hard to get through ethics because you've got to wire up a kid for the day. But so I've just chosen to develop a baseline. I've also got the building specifications, so I'm looking at what they put inside in terms of technological innovations to support the acoustic environment. So Marshall Day Acoustics have been really good at sharing some knowledge on the types of materials that they put in the walls, ceilings, floors, the soft finishings that go in and how we place those. But I'm more interested in the way teachers manipulate the environment for the best speech intelligibility at a moment in time. And it's always thrown me that architects will develop the collaborative space with the cavernous ceilings, the beautiful glass atrium area. That should be your quiet study space, because that's where noise will most likely reverberate. And your noisy collaborative activity should occur in what architects deem quiet spaces. So I think it's a bit reversed. And I think I also think that the open plan spaces offer so much more immense opportunity for kids with disability, because it's not more of the same, because more of the same hasn't been working.
And just an opening question to Joe. I'm reminded of being hurried to a senior university leader's office without warning and asked to quickly explain that if we received a huge amount of money from the state government, and this person was going off to have a meeting like in half an hour with the state treasurer a couple of years ago, what guarantees could we give for the improved academic performance of the students who would use this new facility if the money was forthcoming? And when I fell off the floor, I fell on the floor laughing and then gathered myself up and explained that we couldn't do it that simply. There was a look of disbelief on the part of the university leader. So I'm interested, Joe, in the fact that you've listed what some people would say are very vague, a sense of very vague collection of ideas drawn from the teaching and learning literature, and at best there's a loose fit between those and the spatial consequences that you've tried to map. Is that the best we can do in looking at that literature? Because I'm constantly told by people, well, we should be able to do more, we should be able to be more specific, maybe in the way that Terry's trying to do with his study. Your study is almost at the other end of the spectrum. So how would you respond to someone who asked about it?
Yeah, well, over many years, I've been listening to the questions around, well, how do we know students are actually learning better in these new generation spaces? Why should we continue investing lots of money in them? And I've heard and participated in discussions trying to justify academic improvement, but I've also been involved with a research project that deliberately sought to do that in a tertiary context. So I'm interested in Terry's study, because it's in a primary school context where you can have the children in the same room at the same time every day. In a higher education context, it's not that simple, and there are just too many variables, I believe. I don't know that it's the right question to be asking. And so my response to that question would be, we should be asking the question, is effective teaching and learning taking place in these spaces? And because someone else also mentioned that you can have bad teaching in great teaching and learning spaces as much as you can have great teaching in poor or more traditional teaching and learning spaces. So to me, the important aspect is effective teaching and learning taking place, which means then you have to have an understanding of what effective teaching and learning looks like and the sorts of behaviours that are associated with that before you then, so you can do an evaluation, and it's not just a matter of saying, well, yes, there is, therefore it justifies the spend. It leads to a much broader discussion around how do we get more teachers teaching effectively in these spaces.
Yeah, I'm interested in the comment about great teachers sitting under trees doing great things. That's often been said to me over the years. The person who tells that sort of scenario never describes the experience of the students who are sitting under the tree, who may not be comfortable, may not really want to be there, may be distracted by all the things that are happening outside the tree, and may not be that comfortable in terms of the climate qualities of the environment. None of those things seem to get factored in when you talk about the great teacher.
Just make a comment there too. The assumption is that all students are a homogenous group.
That's what I'm sort of getting at.
And I think that that's part of the issue when we're talking about higher education versus K-12 versus early learning years. It is within that, the students aren't an homogenous group. And if you look at Asperger kids, they freak out in certain settings, yet we've seen some great innovation in developing the furnishings and the barriers within the large open spaces that have actually stopped the need for withdrawing an Asperger's kid to a specialist facility. But we need more research.
So, I think controversial though. Comments or questions from anyone else in the audience just before we break for lunch? Yes, please.
Can I just add to that, that you're actually introducing the idea of time for the student. That is a moment in time of their ongoing experience, and what they, each individual person brings to that situation impacts them as much as teaching.
Absolutely, yeah. If seen from the student's lived perspective, yes. Any other comments or questions? No?
All right. No, I haven't. I was going to wrap. I'm getting hungry.
I think everyone is.
So thank you to everyone for this session. We'll break now for lunch. We'll start again at 2 o'clock sharp. So folks step outside for a little while. I can understand that. Lunch up the back. Thank you, Heather, for organising all of that. And we'll commence again at 2. Thanks, Heather. And